I spent 90 days learning French in order to finally become a polyglot. Now, if you don't know what that means, it means that you're a person who knows to speak more languages than a trilingual person who knows how to speak 3 languages, which means that you have to know at least 4 languages. Now, I always thought that that sounded really cool, and I know that my interest in learning languages isn't going away anytime soon, and I also know that I want to share that with as many people as possible. Now, in order to be able to do that as effectively as I can, I always want to have gone through the process recently enough to be able to put myself into someone else's shoes. That's just to make it easier to help people. Now, I already knew the basics of French, so for those of you who are not aware of it, I had already studied French for 5 years in school. Now, that does sound like a lot more than the 3 months that I was actually studying on my own, but I think most of you are aware of how little you can end up learning in school. Now, I was a good student, at least I think so, but I wasn't doing much aside from the studying that was required in school. Now, going through the calculations, which I tried to make as accurate as possible, that left me with about 250 hours of studying French over the span of 5 years. Now, most of this studying was done while having a teacher explain French concepts to me, like grammar rules and such, in Norwegian, and then having to repeat it because, well, not everyone was paying attention, or because it was too difficult for some of the students. Sometimes that included me. But there were also times that the teacher spent extra time explaining concepts that I had already understood a long time ago. Therefore, I'd say that the actual amount of time that I was effectively studying was a lot lower than that. And so that left me with like less than 250 hours of studying in school over the span of 5 years. And that wasn't really by choice either. So that also plays into it, and it doesn't help the effectiveness of the actual studying. Now, when I was studying French on my own, I spent time reading, I spent time watching series, playing games, and using Duolingo, which, to some extent, that is playing games. But I spent my time watching Pokemon, and in the beginning I watched about 30 episodes of it when I was studying French, but that eventually got stale, so I ended up watching Scrubs, which is one of my favorite series, but it isn't something that is made for kids. If you don't know Scrubs, it's a comedy series that happens in a hospital, and thus the language ends up being a lot more complex. In terms of series, I would recommend, as I always do, to find something that you actually want to watch. This is way more important than having something that is at the perfect level for you. Now, ideally, if you could choose both, you would want something where you are able to understand 90% of what you're hearing or reading when you're studying, and you would over time then be able to understand the rest of it from context. That would happen sort of implicitly without you even realizing it, and that makes the learning as fast as possible and also as effortless as possible, as you're technically learning without even being aware that you are actually learning. Now, this might be the ideal, but even if you're a lot slower when watching a series where you only understand 50% of what is being said, you're much more likely to enjoy a series that is actually made for you than you are watching a simple kids show that you would never want to watch if you weren't learning a language. Now, the only thing that I actually did as far as testing myself goes was that I was doing Duolingo, which is the only thing that I did that actually gave me direct feedback as to how I was performing. Now, Duolingo says that they follow the CEFR framework for at least a French course, and according to them, I reached A2, and I was working towards reaching B1. Now, for those that aren't aware of it, that means that you should have a working vocabulary of about 1,500 words. Now, this is not as straightforward as counting each word as one, as there are additional words such as conjugations that don't equate to one word, but it is still helpful to use that as a way to explain how much you know in language. That means that you have roughly enough to be able to start having conversations about various topics, as long as the conversation is fairly slow and you already know the topics. So you would be able to know how to discuss several topics. But if it wasn't a topic that you already knew, then you'd have a hard time. So that means that I would probably be able to understand, or understand sufficiently enough to be able to travel in France, but it would definitely be a bit of a struggle. Now, my main goal was to be able to say that I could actually speak French by the end of the 3 months. And while I feel like I could say that I do, I'm still not comfortable enough with it yet. But I do believe that I've finally reached the point where it starts being a lot more fun and also a lot more effortless. Like, for instance, I've been watching a bit more of Scrubs lately after I stopped it, and it's definitely gotten easier. Now, what I plan to do moving forward is that I've since gone back to studying Portuguese for the most part, but as I mentioned, I'm still watching an episode every now and then, just to continue making a bit of progress and also not to backtrack. Now, I also might go back to studying French for a month every now and then, just to finally reach that B1, which is stuff where I would say that you can actually speak a language. And lastly, I have my phone set to French, which also helps you not lose any of the things that you actually learned, but it's definitely not enough for you to become fluent. Like, you have to put in a lot more work for that. But at some point, yeah, I'm definitely going back to French, at least to learn like enough to get B1 or maybe even B2. That's about the point where you would be able to get a job in France without having too much, or without having a lot of difficulties. But it was definitely more difficult learning French than it was learning Portuguese. And one of the tools that I used a lot when I was learning Portuguese was that I was speaking to people from Brazil. And that is a lot more difficult to do when you're learning French, because most people that already know French, they aren't really that interested in either learning English or Norwegian or Portuguese for that matter. There really aren't that many people actually interested in talking to me and helping me study. So I spent a lot of time studying French, but that was sort of textbook French, and I don't really know how, or I already know that that means that you don't learn the exact same way that people actually speak, but it should still be sufficient enough for me to say that, okay, I can speak French, just a basic level. I definitely have some more work to do.